Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive?
Let's do it.
Today we're going to untangle a topic that's got a lot of parents and educators, well, a little confused.
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
We're talking about the connection between ASD, that's Autism Spectrum Disorder, and ODD, Oppositional Defiant Disorder.
Two things we hear about all the time.
Right, and they can be so easy to mix up.
Absolutely.
So let's clear up the confusion right off the bat. What are we actually talking about when we say ASD?
Well, when we talk about autism spectrum disorder, we're really talking about a different way of experiencing the world. Thinking about social interactions, communication styles, how we learn, all that good stuff.
Right, and it's a spectrum. It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. Every individual on the spectrum is unique, and ASD can present itself in so many different ways. Some folks might find it hard to pick up on those unspoken social cues, the kind of thing you just get without thinking about it. Others might have difficulty with those back and forth conversations, the give and take that comes so naturally to some. And of course, we can't forget about those intense interests that are often a hallmark of ASD.
Yeah, like our friend who can tell you everything there is to know about, like collecting vintage bottle caps. They're fascinating.
Exactly. That laser focus, that passion, it's incredible.
Okay, so that's ASD in a nutshell. Now, how is ODD different?
So with oppositional defiant disorder, we're talking about a consistent pattern of, well, opposition. Think of a kiddo who's constantly butting heads with authority figures like their parents or teachers. Rules. What rules? And they might have these intense outbursts of anger seemingly out of nowhere.
So both ASD and OD can involve some pretty challenging behaviors.
Right, and that's where the confusion often comes in.
Because on the surface, those behaviors might seem really similar.
But the why behind those behaviors can be completely different. It's like that old saying, right?
What's that?
It's like an iceberg.
Oh, right.
The behavior is just the tip poking out of the water. To really understand what's going on, we've got to dive deeper. Is it sensory overload? Trouble communicating, a need to feel in control? That's where the good stuff is.
This reminds me of something we were reading about, how a loud noise, just a sudden blam, could trigger a complete meltdown in a child with ASD.
Sensory overload is no joke. It's like all the dials are cranked up to 11.
Exactly. But then we read about another child, same reaction, total meltdown, but this time it's because they were told to put away their toys.
They've got ODD, right?
Right, so totally different triggers, same outward behavior.
It's like, how do you even begin to untangle that?
That's why just addressing the behavior itself, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken arm. We got to go deeper, figure out the root cause to give these kids the support they truly need.
It's like trying to put out a fire with a squirt gun when you need the whole fire hydrant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's break out those metaphorical fire hydrants and dive into the nitty-gritty of what makes ASD and ODD different. Because knowledge is power, right? We want to make sure our listeners have the tools they need to understand and support all those incredible kids out there.
Couldn't agree more.
So how can we tell if a kiddo has ASD or ODD? What's that process actually look like?
The diagnosis, that's the roadmap, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, this is what we're dealing with, so how do we move forward? How do we help?
Absolutely. A diagnosis, it's not about labeling a child, putting them in a box. It's about figuring out why they do what they do so we can give them the right support.
So not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. You wouldn't treat a sprained ankle and a broken leg the same way, right?
True, true. Okay, so how do the diagnoses actually differ, between ASD and ODD?
Well, one of the articles we looked at, it actually had this really great breakdown, almost like
A cheat sheet.
yeah, like a cheat sheet. For ASD and ODD, it talked about these three main areas where the diagnoses really diverge: core symptoms, motivation, and intervention.
Ooh, I love a good list. Okay, so let's start from the top. Core symptoms, what are we talking about there?
So with ASD, the core symptoms, they all kind of revolve around this idea of social communication and interaction, along with those repetitive behaviors we talked about, or those very specific interests.
Right, like their own little world.
Exactly. But with ODD, it's all about defiance, irritability, pushing back against authority, like constantly.
Okay, so that makes sense. What about that second one you mentioned, motivation?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, because with ASD, a lot of times those behaviors are coming from a place of like sensory overload or difficulty understanding social cues, or even just trouble communicating in general.
It's not that they're trying to be difficult. It's
No, not at all. It's more like they're trying to navigate a world that feels really overwhelming or like they just don't get it. Imagine being at a party and the music is deafening and the lights are blinding and nobody speaks your language. It's a lot.
Man, yeah, I can see how that would be incredibly overwhelming.
Right. And then with ODD, a lot of times the motivation is more about control. Like they're trying to challenge authority, test the limits, see what they can get away with. It's more intentional.
Interesting. So different motivations, different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah.
Which brings us to that third one you mentioned, intervention. Because how we help a child with ASD is going to look different than how we help a child with ODD, right?
100%. For a kiddo with ASD, we might focus on things like communication skills training, social skills groups, maybe even visual supports like picture cards or social stories, things like that.
So it's about finding ways to help them understand and be understood.
Exactly. And then with ODD, we might look at behavioral therapy, things like parent management training, giving parents and caregivers those tools to set clear limits, respond to challenging behaviors effectively, that kind of thing.
It's more about equipping the adults than trying to fix the child. It's a team effort, really.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that really stood out to me in our research was that statistic about how kids on the autism spectrum are much more likely to also have ODD. That overlap seems important. Why is that?
It's huge. It's like, who knew those two pieces actually fit together?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So connect the dots for us. What's with the overlap?
Well, picture this. You're a kid, and you're already dealing with these social struggles, sensory overload. Maybe people just don't get you.
That's got to be so frustrating.
Incredibly. And sometimes, that frustration, it comes out as oppositional behavior. It's like they're saying, hey, something's wrong, but I don't know how to say it.
So what looks like defiance could actually be a way of trying to communicate a need.
Exactly. And we've got to remember that rigid thinking that can be part of ASD. Kids with ASD, a lot of times they really thrive on routine, on knowing what to expect.
Predictability.
Yeah. So when those routines get messed up or their needs aren't being met, boom, you get those intense ODD-like behaviors.
Wow, it's like their world just got flipped upside down.
It's a way of trying to get that control back, when everything feels out of control.
That makes so much sense.
Mhm.
So it's not about being difficult. It's about trying to cope. So how can we help? As parents, educators, just care of adults, how do we support these kids, ASD, ODD, or both?
The million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
One of the articles we looked at, it had this really cool framework, a three-pronged approach. I think it'll really resonate with our listeners.
3 prongs, huh? I'm listening.
All right, so prong number 1, individualized strategies. We got to ditch that one-size-fits-all stuff. Remember, every kid is different.
Not it.
What works for one kid might not work for another, even with the same diagnosis. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Ain't gonna happen.
Nope. So we need to meet kids where they are, figure out what works for them. Maybe it's a mix of behavioral therapy, social skills training, parent education, maybe even medication sometimes. It depends.
Creating that custom game plan.
Exactly. Prong number 2, this one's all about consistency.
Yeah.
I don't just mean like bedtime routines, though that's important too. I'm talking about a sense of predictability, so they know what to expect. That can really cut down on anxiety, those meltdowns, all those challenging behaviors.
It's creating a safe space, a little haven in the chaos.
Exactly. And then prong number 3, last but not least, communication.
Communication.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's huge for everyone. But how does it work differently for kids with ASD versus ODD?
Great question. So for a child with ASD, we might think about using visual aids like picture cards, social stories, that kind of thing, or just making sure our language is clear, giving them enough time to process and respond, building those bridges.
And for ODD, it might be about setting those really clear expectations and boundaries.
Rubrically. Yes. And enforcing them consistently, using positive reinforcement when things are good, and then appropriate consequences when things aren't. But it's not just about like laying down the law. It's also about really listening to the child, trying to see where they're coming from. Why are they pushing back so hard?
It's like that balance, right?
Yeah.
Firm but fair.
Yeah.
We have those expectations, but we're also creating a space where they feel safe expressing their feelings.
Exactly. Now, we've just scratched the surface here. This is a huge topic. But if there's one thing I want listeners to take away, it's this. Whether you're a parent, a teacher, whoever, approach these challenges with empathy, with understanding, and with a willingness to learn, and you'll be amazed at the difference you can make.
So well said. And you know what? Let's try to shift our thinking here. Instead of seeing these behaviors as problems to be fixed, what if we saw them as clues?
Ooh, I like that.
Like they're showing us, in their own way, what they need. And when we lead with curiosity, not judgment, I think that's where the real understanding begins.
100%.
And remember, you are not alone. There are incredible professionals out there, therapists, educators, doctors, who can help you navigate all this. Don't be afraid to reach out, to ask for help.
Your village is out there.
That's a wrap on another deep dive, everyone. We hope you learned a ton and feel ready to tackle these topics head on. Until next time, keep asking those questions and embracing the beautiful messiness of, well, being human.